So this video is going to be all about research on youth participation. Both you and I are researchers, Dan, and it's interesting because we understand so much about other parts of young people's lives. We know a lot about education, about health, these sorts of things, but I would say that participation is an aspect of a young person's life that we don't really know a lot about. I think it's very important. We need to research and have a knowledge base in terms of how do we design participation opportunities for young people, how do we support them in their participation, and also in terms of really understanding what benefits and challenges participation produces.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just understanding things for the sake of it either. If we're in a field where we're developing policies for young people or designing projects for young people, we should base it on that knowledge. I think one of the areas we've got a lot of knowledge about how people participate is voting. There's a lot of good research out there and data that regularly comes out talking about how people vote, how they join political parties, what the trends are, what influences them to vote. This is quite a well-researched area. You can find data on young people's voting quite easily. But there's other areas that I think are really important to explore as well.
I think monitoring and evaluation, for example, is another area which is really growing in the area of research, and this is really about measuring different outputs and outcomes of young people's participation. I can think of, for example, a really useful toolkit from Save the Children, which is really the beginnings of developing indicators for us to understand how youth participation works and what impact does it have. But of course, when we talk about youth participation, there's a lot of outcomes which are simply difficult to measure. If we think about the positive impact that youth input has in terms of designing policies, this is something which is really under research and also can be difficult to measure. Also in terms of the impact of youth participation on wider societal change. You know, I can think of that as being something very difficult to measure. But of course, this doesn't mean that it's not worth a start in terms of trying to really understand how youth participation really is a benefit for young people themselves, but also their wider communities and society.
Yeah. I think as well as trying to measure the change that happens from participation, there's some quite interesting stuff out there about how participation happens. If you looked at things like the Partispace project, some of the research that comes from Saltopy, some of the research that comes from the Council of Europe, they're really exploring the different types of projects that can be done to support young people's participation, maybe the different ways that young people express themselves in public spaces, and those sorts of things can be really useful if you're trying to design a policy or a project around participation, and maybe you want to get some information about how to make participation more inclusive. There's a lot of good research there that will point you to different practices and different ways of doing participation projects with young people. For example, you could look at some of the research into youth civil society that talks about the shrinking space for youth civil society, the changing landscape of them. So if you're trying to think about how does youth civil society play a role in public participation and decision making, that's really useful stuff to look at to inform what you're doing.
One thing that people forget is actually that research can be a space for participation for young people. Participatory research, or sometimes called participatory action research, involves young people as being the experts, the researchers themselves, in terms of looking at their experiences. So for example, young people would be involved in devising a research question. They would be involved in the collection of data and also ideally in the analysis of that data. And it's really based off of these principles that young people are not necessarily just objects to be studied, but also should play an active part in understanding their lives, and also that they are perhaps best placed to do so.
Some of that work is really exciting. It starts to mix the difference between doing things with young people and learning about young people, particularly when you include that action part of it. I think it's a really interesting place to explore for research, and it really challenges some ideas about how we know and learn about young people's lives.